Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Scott Koenig, Social Studies Consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We promote and encourage teaching the full and complex history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to partner with the institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Teaching comprehensive history webinars are intended to lift the content knowledge of educators to assist attendees' efforts with creating unique learning spaces for students. We hope these webinars lift your efforts in creating student-centered learning environments that include inquiry, critical thinking, and exploration from multiple historical perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. Now here is Dr. Renee Garcia to introduce today's presenter.
Thanks, Scott. Dr. Roy E. Finkenbine is professor of history and co-chair of the history department at the University of Detroit Mercy. He teaches courses in African American history, modern Africa, slave resistance, the Civil War era, and the Underground Railroad, and serves as director of the Black Abolitionist Archive. He received his doctorate in American Cultural Studies from Bowling Green State University in 1982 and joined the Detroit Mercy faculty in 1996. While on the editorial staff of the Black Abolitionist Papers Project at Florida State University in the 1980s and 90s, he co-edited the 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers 1830 to 1865 and Witness for Freedom, African American Voices on Race, Slavery, and Emancipation. He authored Sources of the African American Past, as well as over a dozen articles and book chapters related to the Black abolitionists and the Underground Railroad. Dr. Finkenbine has consulted on museum exhibits, documentary films, and television programs on aspects of African American history. His work has been mentioned in Time, Atlantic, The Washington Post, and USA Today, as well as on NPR Radio. His op-eds have appeared in the History News Network, Time, Newsweek, Raw Story, Alternet, and Faithfully magazine. Currently, Dr. Finkenbine is completing a book entitled Freedom Seekers in Indian Country. Welcome to the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series, Dr. Finkenbine. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Renee. This project, as Renee said, comes from the book I'm working on. I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll bring up in a minute, but I do not consider myself a historian of the Native American experience, but I'm becoming more so as I find out that, my expertise, which I do have in the Underground Railroad, has to tip the hat to Native Americans who, particularly in this part of the country, the old Northwest, the area kind of surrounded or bordered by the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, and the Great Lakes, actually involved a lot of Native American activity. I'm going to share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint, and we'll get started. Okay. And there we go. I use two terms there that may or may not be familiar to some of you. One is freedom seekers, which has become the more common term for those people who were enslaved, primarily in the American South, and making their way to the north, to Canada, to Mexico, to the Caribbean, host of other places. It is used because, while it's not the legal term, fugitive slaves is, it connotes the agency and the desire for freedom of African Americans who were enslaved. And First Nations, which Canadians have used for a long time to talk about Native American peoples, the first North Americans, as it were, but it's gaining considerable currency here in the United States as well. And as I found 3 years ago when I traveled to Australia, Indigenous peoples there are also being referred to as First Nations. This is a photo of the late Helen Hornbeck Tanner. Helen was kind of the dean of Great Lakes Native American historians during her life and career. And in 2009, an interview appeared in Ethnohistory with her. And in the midst of the interview, she talked about African, or as she says here, African American and Native American cooperation. Now we have a tendency, as I'm going to talk about more, to silo these two groups into separate entities and not think about what she says is the considerable coexistence and cooperation between these two groups. And as she notes, though, it's a key example of the link between these two groups, particularly in the Old Northwest, but nothing appears about it in the historical literature. Some of you may know this book. Wilbur Siebert, an Ohio State University professor in the late 19th and early 20th century, don't hold that against him, Michiganders, but he was the first one to do a systematic historical study of the Underground Railroad writ large. And I bring this up because in this book, which was published in 1898, The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, he based it to a large extent on interviews, letters, etc., with those who had been involved in the Underground Railroad. So he mainly includes white folks and a few black activists involved in the railroad. The freedom seekers themselves remain fairly anonymous in the study, but only in one place does he talk about, out of 358 pages, exactly 2 sentences pay attention to the Native American contribution. And there, it's just one Native American village on the Maumee River in northwest Ohio. Well, fast forward 110 years to probably the most significant big picture study of the Underground Railroad, published in 2006 by Fergus Bordewich, a journalist and historian. His Bound for Canaan, again, tries to look at the Underground Railroad writ large, and he does a pretty good job. There's a lot of good stuff in there. But again, out of 439 pages, there are 4 sentences on the assistance given to freedom seekers by Native Americans passing through the region. And this is pretty typical. There aren't individual studies on Native American efforts to help freedom seekers, and almost no books mention it, and if they do, it's a sentence or 2. Well, I'll begin by asking the story, the question, why has this story been erased? I'm going to list 3 things here, and then I'm going to go deeper on a couple of these. One is a lack of standard archival sources to tell the story. Throughout what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to look at some of the sources I've had to go to reconstruct this history. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a tendency to put African American and Native American histories into separate silos and not to talk about how they may have interacted, or to use Tanner's words, coexisted and cooperated. And the third item here is that Native Americans would have been removed from the Old Northwest prior to white settlement, therefore predating the Underground Road. That's absolutely not true. There was considerable overlap in the lower Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, prior to Indian removal or Native American removal in the 1830s and 1840s. And in fact, in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there never was significant removal from the states or territories, even though they may have been pushed off some land that whites eventually settled on. So it's a fairly rich story. Let me go deeper into a couple things here. This issue of not in the standard archival sources. Well, I was trained in a much earlier day, and even today, many historians have a literary bias. They look to archives, they look to printed sources, letters, newspapers, speeches, organizational records. Well, both African American freedom seekers who were fleeing slavery in the South and Native Americans who assisted them in the Old Northwest came from primarily oral cultures. It's estimated, for example, that somewhere between 90 to 95% of the freedom seekers who left the South were not literate. Now, some of these became literate later, and a few that I'm going to talk about actually do pen memoirs and get them published, okay? But in general, there isn't the written record of this interaction with Native Americans because both sides didn't have widespread literacy. The other thing I wanted to go deeper on is this notion that Native Americans left the Old Northwest prior to white settlement, and that's absolutely not true. I mentioned a couple things that are on the slide. James Joseph Buss, a historian, has written this book, Winning the West with Words. And one of the things he does is go into, for the lower Old Northwest states of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, go into things like community festivals, histories, museums, etc., in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what he finds is that for much of this history until fairly recently, they presented it as, Native Americans moved out or were removed, and then whites moved in, and there wasn't this overlap between blacks, whites, and Native Americans. No less an authority than Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, who also wrote histories. In his book, The Winning of the West, he said, "The white settler has merely moved into an uninhabited waste. He does not feel he is committing a wrong, for he knows perfectly well the land is really owned by no one." You don't have this overlap in this view. Well, how did Native Americans assist freedom seekers? I focused on two things that I see lots of evidence from. One is by providing sanctuary. What that means is they welcomed Native Americans oftentimes into their villages, long or short term. Sometimes they were incorporated into the village for the rest of their life, maybe even intermarried with Native Americans and had mixed race children. In other cases, they might reside there for a period of time, 6 months, a year, whatever, and then be assisted further northward to Canada or somewhere else. The second way they helped, Native Americans helped freedom seekers, was by aiding freedom seekers in crossing to Canada. Now, we're in a prime location in Michigan for seeing examples of that. And we oftentimes think of white activists and sometimes Black operatives helping people across the Detroit border riverland, which was a very active place for crossing into Canada. But in Michigan, there's lots of other places, as I'll talk about, including via the Upper Peninsula, which I'm going to share an example of. Again, I want to go just a little deeper to put some flesh on the bones, as it were. This is a guy named Caesar, and this is a modern artist rendering. We don't have any earlier images of Caesar. Caesar was an enslaved man in the Virginia Piedmont who ran away in 1774, headed across the Appalachian Mountains, and made it to Shawnee villages on the Scioto River in the southern half of central Ohio. Caesar, before long, not only was adopted by the Shawnee as part of a ritual, but he married a Shawnee woman, and they had several children. Caesar himself became a warrior with the Shawnee in their attempt to hold on to the Ohio country, even if it meant having to move multiple times their residence as white settlement and white military expeditions made further and further inroads in the country. In fact, we don't have a lot of minute detail on his military exploits, but we do know in 1786, Kentucky forces and American troops were heading towards the Shawnee villages, which had relocated towards the Mad River, kind of west of Columbus a little bit. And there were a series of villages there as well. Caesar posed as somebody who was willing to provide scouting and reconnaissance for those invaders. And he did that right up until the moment he found out where they were headed and who they were going to be attacking. And he immediately then took off in the dead of night, headed to the Shawnee villages on the Mad River, and got them to move as quickly as they could. There were still a few villages that suffered death and damages, but and they had to abandon their cornfields and other crops and moved to northwestern Ohio, where he continued to fight to try to hold on to the land in the 1790s, ultimately up until the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which essentially, followed by the Treaty of Greenville, led to the removal of Native Americans from about 3/4 of Ohio. Caesar had several children. Two of these known to history, literally in documents, as Sally, who was his wife, Sally's black son, and Sally's white son, because of difference in hue, actually fought with Tecumseh and did their utmost through the War of 1812 to to hold on to their part of the Old Northwest. Caesar eventually and Sally, after the Treaty of Greenville, moved beyond the Mississippi and died shortly after the War of 1812. Two freedom seekers that made it with the assistance of Native Americans to Canada were these two fellows, Josiah Henson and Jermaine Logwin, who later became literate, became well-known Black abolitionists, and wrote their stories, which include being assisted by Native Americans. Josiah Henson was a slave in Kentucky near the Ohio River. He had a family and several children. By all accounts, he was a loyal slave to his owner. And at one point, he asked his owner if he could buy his freedom. They set up a payment plan. And when he paid off the cost of his freedom, his owner went back on the deal. And it's that point in 1830, Josiah Henson and his wife began planning to abscond. They created primitive backpacks to put the younger children on their back. They got another slave to row them across the Ohio River under cover of darkness. And after wandering in southern Indiana for the better part of 2 weeks, they made it to Cincinnati, where the Black community there helped get them northward some distance. And ultimately, then they literally are following the trail northward, where they are almost to the point of exhaustion and starvation, and a group of Native Americans comes across them on the trail, takes them in, helps them out, gives them a wigwam to sleep in, gives them food and a place to rest, and then takes them a good distance in the rest of the journey towards Sandusky, Ohio, where they're able to stow away on a ship across Lake Erie. Jermaine Logwin, about 5 years later, in 1835, with a friend, John Flournoy, escapes from the hinterlands surrounding Nashville, Tennessee, pose as free Blacks, steal a couple of horses, and make their way northward to the Ohio River, where, again, another African American helps row them across the river under cover of darkness. And initially, people in Black settlements and Quaker settlements help them make their way northward till they get to the northern third of Indiana, which is Potawatomi country. And this is the dead of winter. And they're taken in and assisted regularly by Potawatomi families who will put them up, feed them, give them a place to rest, and provisions to go on their way. And both Henson and Logwin write about this Native American aid and ultimately getting to Canada in their autobiographies. Well, one of the questions that I ask, and you probably are asking, is why did Native Americans assist freedom seekers? Part of it seems to have been self-interest. Freedom seekers could bring things like new seeds, new technologies, greater experience in interacting with whites, and a whole host of other things that made them attractive, at least in the short run, to the residents of Native American villages. But there was something beyond that. For many Native Americans in the 19th century in the Old Northwest, they were seeing their population numbers decline. In the Ottawa villages on the Maumee River in Northwest Ohio, for example, in a decade, their population was cut in half, bringing young male freedom seekers, which was the bulk of the um, freedom seekers in the early years making it this far north, um, could help them expand bloodlines, population within their communities. And Native Americans had always brought in Native American captives, white captives, and so they viewed this much the same way, as they could be incorporated into their village as a way of expanding the population. Second thing, a common sense of kinship due to oppression by whites. Native Americans many looked at the slaves in the South and those they encountered making it northward as being common victims with them of white settler expansionism. And a good example is among the Ojibwe. Several Ojibwe Methodist missionaries who wrote a fair bit about this talk about the Ojibwe taking an active role in helping freedom seekers either to get to Canada or bringing them into their villages out of a sense that they were, to use their terms, cousins or brothers. And in fact, there was a fair bit of intermarriage in Michigan, for example, between Ojibwe and freedom seekers. And the third is customs of hospitality. Many groups, the Potawatomi, which have a significant presence throughout the Old Northwest, but particularly in southern Michigan, had a very, we hear the term radical hospitality a lot today. They practice radical hospitality. Their cultural norms said that unless somebody could be defined as an enemy, one was to welcome them in, even if they were a stranger, and provide them with all the hospitality that was required, food, a place to sleep, entertainment, directions, etc. And during COVID, it's when I was coming to this part in my research. And yes, I did find some archival sources that bore this out. Some of the early French and English explorers in the Old Northwest talked about literally being welcomed in to Potawatomi villages for an entire season, because that was their cultural demand to what they were supposed to do for strangers. But because I couldn't make it to many libraries or archives during that period of COVID, I was able to use informants that I knew to make contact with Potawatomi elders and organizations that put me in touch with tribal groups that put me in touch with Potawatomi elders and groups of elders that I could do virtual interviews with. And even today, they talk about how they feel it is a demand within their culture that even if someone is a stranger, if they need food, a place to crash for the night, etc., that it is your obligation to give it to them. And they extended this to the freedom seekers. One woman who I interviewed who grew up in Grand Rapids in the 1930s and was a Potawatomi, is a Potawatomi, talked about, strangers would come to their door in Grand Rapids, white, black, other Native Americans, and her parents would bring them in, feed them, help them, give them a place to sleep 1, 2, 3 nights a week, 2 weeks, whatever the person needed. And so the custom of hospitality with certain groups, particularly the Potawatomi, played a huge role. Well, we're not advancing, okay? Oops. We got stuck there for a second. I'm going to share 2 Michigan stories that illustrate this. The first one really is a story of Michigan Native Americans, particularly the Odawa and the Ojibwe, helping a group of freedom seekers get to Canada, what is today Ontario, central Ontario. The second is a story of an Odawa Ojibwe community in northern Michigan, providing sanctuary for a freedom seeker's family. These are both interesting stories, and they actually are 2 chapters in the latter part of my book in progress. The first story starts, or we become aware of this in what is today Grand Rapids, at the actual rapids on the Grand River, where the city today resides. This is what it would have looked like about 1830, 1831. Now, this map shows you the Native American presence. The upper part of the map, you can see North Ottawa or Odawa Village, and near the lower left, you could see the South Ottawa or Odawa Village. Now, by the Treaty of Chicago of 1821, the area southeast of the Grand River had been opened to white settlement, and by 1833, when the story begins, much of the settlement had begun to just appear on the area of the side of the river opened by treaty. On the other side were these 2 Native American villages, and you see that one has a mission just south of it, actually a Baptist mission, and the South Ottawa Village has near it a Catholic mission. 2 very different approaches to interacting with whites. The North Ottawa Village was actually thinking that they had to start accommodating and assimilating to white culture, to a Baptist form of Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. The South Ottawa Village, headed by a guy known as Chief Blackskin, not because of color, but because of the winter fur coat that he wore, actually was more resistant to assimilation and accommodation, keeping to true Indian culture and ways, which is why when the Catholic mission came in, they liked that because they thought the Catholic missionaries were less pushy in their evangelization. Well, the story begins in 1833, and this comes largely from oral tradition, but I've been able to back it up from other sources of different kinds. I'm going to talk about that later. Apparently, this was in the fall of 1833. We know that it was fall from oral tradition. We know that it was in all likelihood 1833 because it's not until the early 1830s that freedom seekers are known to have appeared in the Grand Rapids area. And by 1835, 36, these villages are being decimated first by smallpox and then disappearing entirely. The reason I position it at 1833 is because we know from the oral tradition it was a period when it was not safe to send freedom seekers on to the Detroit River borderland. Now, for those of you who know what the Blackburn case or the Blackburn affair is in Detroit in 1833, this is a huge case where two freedom seekers who have made their way northward from slavery in Kentucky, lived in the city, posing as free people for a couple of years, are found out, captured, and the community, particularly the Black community, rises up and protects them and gets them over to Canada. The result of that, though, is there were tons of authorities and freedom seekers along the Michigan side of the Detroit River for some time, which is why it would not have been safe to send them northward or send them eastward into Canada. You notice the Indian Trail that leads to the upper left area. There were 20 freedom seekers that came and appealed to the South Ottawa village for assistance. They couldn't send them to Detroit, they didn't think. So they took them northward, arranged with 10 Odawa escorts from further north that came south and escorted them up this trail. And then you follow the red there through Odawa villages along Lake Michigan, ultimately past Grand Traverse Bay, Little Traverse Bay, and to the point at the tip of Michigan's lower peninsula. And that is right there on Mackinac Strait at a council site. This is an 1842 image, a council site where Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa leaders, the three fires in that we know from Michigan history, had met regularly for councils. There, they were turned over to a group of, by prearrangement, to a group of Ojibwe escorts and taken in war canoes under cover of darkness over to what is today St. Ignace, and then through a couple of Ojibwe villages, back into canoes, and across to central Ontario. Let me just segue out for a moment and say one of the other things I've had to depend on in this research is DNA evidence. There's a researcher named Clyde Winters in Chicago who has identified that there's a chromosome, a Y chromosome, RM173, which largely it turns up in people in sub-Saharan Africa and of sub-Saharan African descent. The only other places it turns up in any significant number is among Native Americans in the Old Northwest and the South, which had lots of interaction with freedom seekers. So groups like the Seminole in Florida, which helped a lot of freedom seekers, have an elevated number. The highest number, however, that Winters found is that something like 85, 89% of contemporary Ojibwe have this Y chromosome. And so in addition to oral tradition, some written records, there's DNA evidence of this kind of interaction. And in fact, the Ojibwe both welcomed freedom seekers into their villages, intermarried with them, and also helped others get across to Canada through this, what I call northern door in the Upper Peninsula. Now, where did these 20 freedom seekers that were escorted northward end up? It appears it probably was where you see the red arrow pointing, Manitoulin Island. Manitoulin Island is on the Canadian side, but it's the largest island by far in Lake Huron. It was an area that by the 1830s had become a Odawa and Ojibwe reserve. And I've been told by several Potawatomi elders in interviews that they believe that it's almost certain that this is where they would have taken these 20 freedom seekers. Now, a little bit about the provenance, since we're talking about a oral tradition. How did this get passed down, and why should we rely on it? This is Louis McSabe. At the time of the Underground Railroad story we just talked about, he was on the verge of manhood. His father was one of the 10 escorts, Odawa escorts, that took the freedom seekers north to Mackinac Strait. Louis McSabe heard the stories and probably encountered the freedom seekers when they were in the South Odawa village. And he told the story throughout his long, long life. And then he passed it on to his son, John McSaba, who we know regaled Odawa audiences in Petoskey with it in the 1930s. In the 1930s, the Native American section of Petoskey was known as Hungry Hollow. It's the 1930s, it's pre-television. People would gather in the evenings on back porches, tell stories. There was also one guy who was an unlicensed barber whose porch became the favorite spot. And he also had the only radio in Hungry Hollow. And so people would gather, listen to the radio, get their hair cut, tell stories. And John McSaba oftentimes shared this story with audiences on those back porches. Well, one of the people, as a young man, who heard the story told there and later incorporated it into his repertoire as he became a storyteller, was a guy named Bill Dunlop, who you see here. He later told the story as one of the chapters in a book that he co-authored called The Indians of Hungry Hollow. Now, Marcia Blackledge, who was his co-author, who's an Ojibwe writer and artist, kind of had to tease the story over many trips to IHOP, which Bill liked, many mornings at IHOP over pancakes, he would help flesh out parts of the story. He occasionally brought other Odawa elders who were able to confirm parts of the story. Bill himself, during his long life, he's now passed, but during his long life, also heard elements of the story from Ojibwe storytellers in the Upper Peninsula. And there are family stories passed down multiple generations of Ojibwe who grew up in the Upper Peninsula about their families helping freedom seekers across to Canada via, that area south of the Sault Ste. Marie. In 2004, the book came out, and Marcia Blackledge, Bill's co-author, went on a book tour in Michigan, and she actually had African Americans come up to her and say, this story sounds very familiar. I think my ancestors were among the freedom seekers being aided by Native Americans, the Odawa and Ojibwe. Then the next story I'd like to share quickly is the story of William Swan. William Swan is a freedom seeker who flees Virginia. Um, by this point, he's a man in his 30s. Flees, it appears, in the late 1850s, makes it to Park County, Indiana. Park County has some abolitionist sentiment, but it also has, it's close enough to Kentucky, it has a number of slave catchers and kidnappers that come north looking for fugitive slaves and even free blacks. There he meets a free black woman named Louisa Morgan, whose parents had been slaves in North Carolina and had come north after they were manumitted or freed. William Swan and Louisa Morgan fall in love, have a child, and at some point, right about the time the Civil War breaks out, make a decision that because of the dangers of slave catchers and freedom seekers, they needed to go north for safety. And they end up heading to the Charlevoix area. You see the arrow here, but probably they actually went to Chicago in all likelihood, and then went northward via Lake Michigan steamer, getting off at Traverse City. They would have walked what is now State Route 31 northward to Charlevoix, and then on trails um, uh, eastward a little bit to that area you see, so it says Swan Farm, right at the center north shore of Pine Lake, which today we know as Lake Charlevoix. Now, when they get there, and this is a view of looking down from what would have been their farm acreage towards what is today Lake Charlevoix. They came without any work animals, without a knowledge of farming in this northern environment. Remember, William was from Virginia. And so early on, it was Native Americans in the area who helped them clear 16 of the 40 acres they ultimately claimed, who helped them build a log cabin and outbuildings, and who showed them how to plant crops the Indian way, mainly corn, beans, and squash, with the squash intercropped in the rows between corn rows. And they made a go of it. But I think of this couple coming into this new terrain without any knowledge of the agriculture, the winters, etc. And think, boy, they were brave. It shows you how desperate they were to find a place of safety. And fortunately, they found these welcoming Indians. The closest neighbors of the Swans, when they relocated north of Pine Lake or Lake Charlevoix, was a 300-person Odawa Ojibwe congregation. Today it's known as Green Sky Native American United Methodist Church. Then it was known as the Pine Lake Michigan Mission. Um, uh, this building was apparently initially started in the 1830s, finished in the 1850s. It's named Green Sky today because the founder, the moving force, was a Ojibwe Methodist missionary named Peter Greensky. They had initially founded their mission close to Charlevoix, but in, I guess, true case of cultural insensitivity, whites, including white missionaries, complained because the congregation members were too noisy when they worshiped and prayed. So they headed out further into the wilderness. Peter Greensky, once the Civil War broke out, particularly by 1863, when Blacks and Native Americans and others could enlist, began preaching sermons and giving advice that members of the congregation, including his own family, needed to look out for the interests of enslaved people in the South. And so here you see recruiters swearing in two Native Americans from the Upper Great Lakes. Actually, two of his sons enlisted in Company K, which is an all-Indian unit of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. One was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness, and one was disabled at the Siege of Petersburg. So Native Americans actually looking out for the best interests of enslaved peoples. By the period immediately after the war ends in 1865, whites start to move in. And this was prompted in part by the Homestead Act, which allowed you to live on property for 5 years and then get it deeded to you if you'd improved it, built a house, etc. At that point in 1867, William Swan goes to the Homestead land office and fills out a form, and this becomes his property. Now, tragically, as a free man now, technically, the war freed him, and his family continued to grow. William tried to continue to live, as always, with more and more white neighbors in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. It led to his undoing in what I've called the in 19th century hate crime. You see the map here. He had some relatives coming in by lake steamer to Traverse City. He walked down from his farm and then Charlevoix down towards Traverse City to meet them. At Atwood, he was accosted verbally, called the N-word and other things by two brothers named Russell, who had been in the Union Army during the Civil War and had settled fairly recently there. One of the Russells was the postmaster of Atwood. Actually, guns were drawn, but one of the Russells' wives came out, settled things down, and William went on his way. Ultimately, the two Russell brothers and another white man decided to follow him, teach him a lesson. They caught up with him just a few miles north of Eastport and shot him dead. At this point, word got back not only to Louisa and the family, but to the Green Sky Indians, as they were increasingly known. They came down, built a makeshift stretcher, and carried his body from Eastport back to Green Sky Church. They searched to try to get a place to bury him, a white graveyard or public graveyard. No one would take him in, so he's buried almost immediately in the churchyard around Green Sky Church. Here you see the only other witness besides the perpetrators, Congregationalist, white Congregationalist minister named Reverend E. Lincoln, said no one believes Swan would have been killed if he'd been a white man, kind of making that hate crime idea real. Here's what for a century and a quarter probably was the marker marking his grave in Green Sky Churchyard. You see the language on there, Ishpeming, which roughly heaven, the date, a Christian cross, his name, acknowledging that he was a slave, acknowledging that he had fled north, and then adopting him as in death as a Green Sky brother this Native American community. Um, it uh, it I've been able to contact a gravestone expert who says, based on the look of it, almost certainly was put there between the 1870s and 1890s. Unfortunately, a storm in the winter of 2019 brought down a giant branch which broke the marble slab to smithereens. Mary, and I'll close with this, Mary Morgan, who was a in-law of Louisa Swan, William's wife, was contacted then afterwards, and she'd had a series of things: William's death, subsequent trials of the murderers. One was acquitted, one wasn't even charged. The third one escaped west after he was released on his own recognizance. And Mary Morgan, her in-law, said, "Why don't you come south? You're there among the savages." And here is Louisa's response: "Better neighbors I have not lived with than these. They are indeed kind, and those Indians are so far from being savages that they are the better part of them Christians. They are not savages, but friends." I'll just bring up my contact information if you would like that. And thank you for listening, and I hope this has been informative. I'll keep that for a second. Okay.
Well, yes, thank you, Dr. Finkenbine. This was wonderful, and we really appreciate this content and the images that you put together, just amazingly in the sense of making connections with multiple cultural spaces. And as many of us being historians, we really appreciate this share. So thank you to you. Your efforts are important to Michigan's educators and leaders as it provides support for teaching comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you helping us learn more deeply about the role of Native Americans in the Underground Railroad. Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all. We encourage you to visit Michigan Virtual and the Teaching Comprehensive History websites to access past presentations, materials, and updates to further support your content knowledge. Thank you all attendees for joining us today and for the work you do for Michigan students.
Thanks to everyone there.